The title to this video is not clickbait. You're about to find out one of the oldest reef aquarium that a hobbyist owns in existence uses a plenum for the past 40 years. That's coming up next, so stay tuned. Hello everybody, this is Dr. Novak. I'm going to talk about a fellow called Paul Baldassano's Reef Aquarium, and it's 40 years in the making. And it's from the Reefkeeping, and Reefkeeping is an online magazine that you can read. And this information was brought to me by one of the viewers on my station. I'm going to read you some excerpts from the article, so I'm not going to read you the whole article, but I will have below the whole link. So if you want to read the entire article about Paul, about Paul, you can. Okay. Now, apparently this Reef Aquarium is over 40 years old and uses a slow-moving plenum. As I've told you before, years ago when we used to use under-gravel filters, basically an under-gravel filter is nothing but a Schober plenum. Basically, they're one and the same. An under-gravel filter plate basically is a plenum. And Dr. Schober from France came up with a plenum without using any kind of uplift tubes at all. Well, basically, as I've told you, under-gravel filters were misused in their time. And as time went on from the 50s to the 60s and 70s, and then people started taking their under-gravel filters and running them faster and faster and faster to pump water through them to do the nitrogen cycle, they actually ruined that whole part of the hobby. And that's why today so many people say, oh, all they are is mechanical sinks for dirt and everything else. This article that has been written kind of goes through that what has happened and how come this particular person's aquarium or reef tank has been going on for 40 years using a slow moving plenum. And when I started doing the research on this, it's because we used under-gravel filters, and then all of a sudden Schober came out with his plenum. And then I started thinking, well, a plenum is nothing but an under-gravel filter. Basically, that's it. Whether it's a ½ inch high or an inch high, it's basically a void underneath your substrate. And this void has been, well, discarded through the years because of the under-gravel filter gave it a bad name, meaning that when it was brand new in the hobby and they made under-gravel filters, they were used correctly. But as time went on, they soon were used incorrectly, and therefore the whole idea of an under-gravel filter went to the wayside. Now, I know there are people out there who are still going to insist that it doesn't work, but in this article with Paul's aquarium, he's had up for 40 years using a slow-moving plenum. Basically, that's what he's using, a slow-moving plenum. And he's been using it for 40 years. Now, how many people can make the claim to fame that they've had their aquarium going for 40 years with substrate at the bottom of their aquarium? And do they have any proof? Do they have pictures? Do they have any proof to substantiate what they'd be saying? like Paul does. Anyhow, I'm going to read you some excerpts out of the article, and you can read the whole one. It says, the reason my tank is rather unique is because my methods were developed and evolved at the beginning of the saltwater hobby and many years before the internet became a major factor. Today, many tanks look similar because almost everyone gets their information from the internet. This is a hobby, a pastime, and by definition, only important to us hobbyists. There are no degrees, no fellowships, no doctorates to be awarded for the hobby. So experts are basically self-proclaimed. That one sentence is absolutely right. Everybody now has become an expert. They go out there because of the internet and YouTube. They try to disprove things to show everybody, look at me, I'm the expert. And they're just all self-proclaimed experts with no research, no nothing, no doing things correctly, no protocol to be followed. They now become experts, and YouTube becomes their channel of a way to let thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people know their ideas, whether they're right or wrong, whether they have proven anything or not. They now have become the expert. This is, and I'll continue on, this is the reason there are so many different ways to start and manage a tank. It is also an expensive hobby, which unfortunately after a few years forces many people to sell everything and go on to other endeavors due to frustration. To me, my aquarium is not just a hobby. I have had a tank for some kind every day of my life from the 1950s, and it is an integral part of who I am. As far back as I can trace, my ancestors were fishermen in Europe. Of course, I didn't have a saltwater tank until saltwater fish became available in about 1971. And that's true. Back in about 1971, there was a guy named Moe, and he wrote a book on saltwater back in the early 70s about how to keep saltwater. Back then, it was in its infancy, saltwater aquariums and keeping fish. And it was Moe who was the one who wrote a book about it. I have his book, and he was the original one that I can remember that actually started the saltwater hobby, basically going on to what it is today. When I saw my first blue double, I had to have one, or 7. This is a story about my experience, my success, and my failures. Okay, and then it has in quotations, I took out the under gravel filter last year for a cleaning. I do that every 25 years, whether it needs it or not. Now that's a long time to be running an under gravel filter. 25 years he took it out to clean it. That's a pretty amazing claim to fame. And this is in a saltwater aquarium, mind you. This is not freshwater, but saltwater. Okay, my first failure was when I tried a deep sand bed. I used the standard beach sand from Long Island Beach, which is much too fine. It turned black in no time, and I had to rescue the fish. It kind of reminds me of the betta tank that I made, and I used sand, not as fine, but more open, and for what, 2 months, the thing, all it had was algae growing all over everything, just a mess. There was a pure case of sand being at least 5 inches, 4 to 5 inches deep, and I had to take it down. I just did a video on that recently. There's another case of deep sand bed, didn't work for me, and I had to take it down and redo it with a Plenum. Let's see. Okay, continue on. I also found that a driveway gravel had other problems as well. Apparently he used driveway gravel. Luckily, dolomite became available, and that is what I use. Dolomite, in case none of you remember, was used it was a white stone, and it was in its infancy of saltwater tanks that people would use dolomite, crushed dolomite. And I don't even know if people even sell it anymore, dolomite. But anyhow, it was to keep your pH up, and that's what they use, a dolomite. Okay, the article goes on. After about a year, the undergravel filter clogged, effectively stopping the nitrification process and causing undue stress to the fish. It became rampant, and the gravel was filthy. Back then, that's when they started changing undergravel filters to 1-inch lift tubes. They made the lift tubes higher than the 5.5 to 6 inches, the 3/8 lift tubes that used to be with undergravel filters. They started getting like Penplax and stuff like that. They started getting fancy with the undergravel filters. They started coming with 1-inch lift tubes to really make a draft. And then after that, they changed that to higher flow output. And then they changed to motors. And it just went on from there. And that's why he's claiming the thing was filthy. Yes, you had a good idea and you ruined it because you made it a mechanical filter. The undergravel filter then became a mechanical filter, just like your canisters or your hang on the back filter. It just became another mechanical filter. Okay, I'll continue on. I had to use a Diatom filter. It shows a picture of them with an old Diatom filter that we used to have in the old days. It was really a pretty good filter. Vertex, I think, made it, if I remember correctly, because I had one, and it had a bag in it, and then you would put the Diatom powder in there, and it would circulate, stick to the bag, and then you can clean your aquarium with this Diatom filter. Those kind of filters have kind of went to the wayside today. People don't really use Diatom filters anymore. I don't think but it was a nice filter. It was a direct drive impeller filter. And let's see, you had to use a Diatom filter, a canister filter with a very fine filter media in it. This filter necessitated the removal of all the coral skeletons for cleaning. There was no live rock available in the trade at that time. And that was true. At that time in the early stages, there was no. You had coral. You had bleached out white coral. And that's about the most you could put in your fish tanks. This is the reason almost no one uses an undergravel filter anymore. Because the advent of the undergravel filters, though saltwater fish could not be successfully kept in captivity by the hobbyists. So he basically says this was the demise of the undergravel filter. We were told, run them faster and faster and faster. They died out. Then all of a sudden, this Dr. Schober from France, a professor, he did some studies on a Plenum, which is basically an undergravel filter, but he did not run an uplift tube of any sort to it. And all of a sudden, that sparked my interest because I was working on the anoxy filter is, wait a second, a Plenum is nothing but an undergravel filter. The only difference with what Schober is doing and what I decided to do is you can either make a Plenum or you can make a slow-moving Plenum. And that's what I discovered, that a slow-moving Plenum was better than just using a Plenum without an uplift tube. And that's what I've been trying to teach you. But the uplift tube I changed to, instead of a 1-inch, I changed it to the 3/8 tube like we used to use back in the 60s and early 70s before they were phased out to the 1-inch lift tubes. I didn't make it as high in order to prevent the draft, and I didn't run it as fast. And the results I got were amazing. Okay, I'll continue on with the article. Anyway, I knew there had to be a better way. In 1979, my wife and I moved to a larger home. The contents of the 30-gallon tank were transferred into a 100-gallon tank. However, this time I did not run the under-gravel filter the same way. Instead, I reversed it and sent the water down the uplift tubes. Now, this is something before the under-gravel filter kind of got phased out. People would send the water in reverse. Now, I showed students, this is back in the 70s, we had a 55-gallon tank, and the 55-gallon tank came with 2 plates, and I used Penplex plates. So you had 24 and 24-inch plates, and each plate could have 2 uplift tubes. So what we did, and I showed my students this, we only added 1 uplift tube to each plate. And then we connected up a hang-on-the-back filter. Now these hang-on-the-back filters back then were starting to become like muscle cars. You can buy a hang-on-the-back filter that put out over 600 gallons an hour back then. Normally, hang-on-the-back filter back then in the early 70s, late 70s, you could easily 350, 375 gallons an hour these filters would put up. So we connected up to each filter plate a 600 gallon an hour filter, hang on the back filter with floss and carbon. So all the water that was going into the under gravel was cleaned from the hang on the back filter. So there was 2 hang on the back filters. So altogether you were pumping 1,200 gallons an hour through these 2 filter plates, which was a lot. Now the whole question I brought up to the students is, what do you think is going to happen? We're cleaning the water before it goes into the under gravel filter. We're pumping 600 gallons an hour through these under gravel filters of only 2 foot long in a 55-gallon tank. Do you think, one, that we are going to grow nice, good bacteria in it because of this, or do you think it's going to clog up just like if you had a under gravel filter with the uplift tubes, where it's pulling the detritus and fish poop and everything into it? Now this is going the opposite way, but 600 gallons an hour, okay? And so everyone wrote out what they thought was going to happen running it this way. What we had found out, though, is the under gravel filter that we use, the gravel was just as dirty as if we would to have reversed it. So we found out that reversing the flow into an under gravel filter did nothing to keep the gravel clean. It still was as dirty as if it would have flown the other way, because it was flowing too fast to begin with. And the under gravel filter once again became a dirt trap. Even at 600 gallons an hour going through a 2-foot plate, it still became a dirt trap. It wasn't like dirt and everything and mum and everything would be blowing off of it and get sucked up. It didn't happen. And everybody thought, wow, it's got to happen. This is 600 gallons an hour. It did not happen. Okay, so I'm going to continue on with this. He's using a reverse. As the years went by, I found that the under gravel filter would work better if I diverted the water through a filter, such as a sponge filter, before it went under the gravel, like I said, that was one of the things I did with students. It was cleaned, it went through carbon before it went to the gravel, but we were pumping it very, very fast. I also experiment with different flow rates and discovered that if I fed the filter with tank water at a very slow rate, such as 50 gallons per hour down each tube, I would also achieve denitrification. Okay? I'm going to read that again. This is very important, what he found out. I found that the under-gravel filter would work better if I diverted the water through a filter, such as a sponge, before it went under the gravel. I also experimented with different flow rates and discovered that if I fed the filter with tank water at a very slow rate, such as 50 gallons per hour down each tube, it would also achieve denitrification. This is in a saltwater aquarium. I tried saltwater and freshwater. Basically, you're talking about you have so many strains of bacteria, whether they be salt or freshwater, and those strains can be divided between the two. But isn't that interesting? This is the same thing I've been teaching you. About 50 gallons an hour or less to go through your plenum. That's why it's called a slow-moving plenum, because this has been achieved, well, since I was experimenting over 40 years ago. I found out that we ran our under-gravel filters wrong. Okay, after these modifications, the tank went 25 years before I removed the rocks and stirred the gravel for a thorough cleaning. Although I have quite a few theories regarding this tank's success, I feel that a reverse flow, slow running under gravel filter is the main reason this tank has lasted successfully for 4 decades. Remember, I've told you I've had tanks go 10, 15 years or longer using a plenum, where I was diverting water into a canister filter and a little bit of water went maybe 10, 20 gallons or less, and the rest of the water from the canister filter was sucked from the aquarium. And it was, since water takes the path of least resistance, I knew that very little water was being sucked in one way to the canister than another way. I've talked about that in my videos, where that was one of the experiments I did, so I didn't have to use a bubbler. And like I said, those tanks lasted for years and years and years before I would have to move the tank, because you're going to wallpaper or paint or something. Otherwise, the tank would have never been moved. Even the antique tank I have, in fact, had a plenum in it for like 15 years straight. Never was cleaned or anything, till finally I had to pull the tank apart to move it away from the wall, just so I could do, painting or wallpapering or something. Then I had to put it back. But here's another case. Okay, now I'm going to read you the very end of the article. Like I said, there's a lot more to this article. I'm just reading you excerpts. There is one more non-typical thing that I do that some may consider either risky or just useless. I mentioned above that I add bacteria from the sea to my tank. I feel bacteria are the most overlooked aspect of this hobby and are the vital to a healthy, long-lived tank. Bacteria cover everything in our tanks, but are they the correct bacteria for our purposes? Probably not. Bacteria enter our tanks in a number of various ways. Every time we put our hands in the water, we add bacteria. When we add fish, coral, rock, or food, we add bacteria. The bacteria on the rocks and fish were at one time in the sea, and some of these bacteria are the correct bacteria for our needs. but eventually the bacteria will stop reproducing and will outnumber or be outcompeted by other bacteria that may not be dangerous but do not necessarily help complete the nitrogen cycle. Why do so many people change so much water and still have nitrates? Good question. Why do people keep changing so much water and you still have a ton of nitrates? Good, very good question. If we had the correct number and type of bacteria, we would never have to change water just to lower nitrates. The bacteria do that for us for free. Boy, does this sound like what I've been talking about on my channel and where people are dissing me saying, oh no, you need plants. Plants, yeah, unreliable plants are. Bacteria is always going to be there. It's never going to go away. Plants, they live and die. I have found that by adding bacteria from the sea a few times a year, my reef stays healthy and I have no scientific data on this theory. But I do have a 40-year-old tank with an under gravel filter and no nitrates. That in itself is a pretty big claim to fame, I would say. For someone to say that I've had an aquarium for 40 years with no nitrates, salt water on top of it, and I use a Plenum. Today, the term under gravel filter really relates to the plate that you're using. It's called an under gravel filter plate. Now, I never made any claims that I invented the under gravel filter. Some people say, oh, he acts like he invented it. No, the under gravel filter has been around before I was born. And then it changed over to from Professor Schober doing a Plenum, which is basically an under gravel filter plate being 1 inch high instead of like a ½ inch high. Basically, that's all it was. So I never made any claim that I invented the Plenum. I never make any claim that I did the under gravel filter. What I make claim to is through research, I found out that we were using it incorrectly. And a long, long time ago, they did use them correctly by filling them with 3-4 inches of gravel back then and running them with only one little 3/8 uplift tube that probably put out less than 50 gallons an hour, that little uplift tube, maybe more like 30 gallons an hour. Hobbyists didn't realize what they were doing. They were doing everything correctly back then, but it just changed and ruined that whole subject of under gravel filters, bad. You know, no filter, under gravel filter at all, good. Well, like the guy says, self-proclaimed professionals. All of a sudden, somebody comes up, I'm a self-proclaimed professional, you have to do it my way because I found out this way's better. And there are so many different ways because so many people have jumped on the gravy train of I'm a professional and listen to me. And especially now since YouTube's out there, everybody's got a YouTube channel. They're starting. And it really gets confusing for the brand new hobbyists to know what's right and what's wrong. But basically this article that was sent to me or told to me by one of my YouTube Patreons, who I talk to from time to time. And that's another thing. I'll bring this up on ending this whole thing is I do talk to people from time to time who belong to my YouTube channel. I never ask for anybody like a Patreon or anything to pay for me to talk to them. You know, if you think about it, these channels, they want you to buy the privilege for them to talk to you or have special privileges given to you. You have to buy into the club. I've never felt that. that what money I make, what little money I make from YouTube is enough, and we don't have to go with this patron stuff. We don't have to go where, well, you will get this benefit if you pay me. I'll give you a privilege. And I've never done that with anybody who is a member of my channel. I've never said, you know, oh, you got to pay me money. And I've talked to lots of people on my channel, even had phone conversations with them for over an hour or more, absolutely free, just because they were one of my YouTube subscribers. And I think just because you're a subscriber, you've earned to the right if you want to talk to me. I've even had people that have come over to my house here in Florida and have visited and wanted to see and talk. Fine. You don't have to pay me to do that. Okay, it's not, I never felt that was right, because in other words, then you're no different than a fish store, you know, where you're basically, you can care about anybody. You don't care about anybody. As long as you're going to spend money, you care about them. Once the money stops being spent, you can care less whether they come into your store or not, because you're not making any money. I never felt that. I never felt that I should charge anybody anything just to ask me a question. I do my best, you know. That's all I can say. But anyhow, this was a very interesting article. One of the oldest reef aquariums going today, unless there's another hobbyist who can have a claim to fame that they have a reef aquarium going for more than 40 years, uses a slow-moving plenum. Basically, that's what he uses. He uses it in reverse, but I found out myself that, as I explained to you with the experiment I done with the students, it didn't matter. I like to do it the way a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I use a little bit of a Professor Schauber's method of making the plenum, and an uplift tube to move that water in the plenum slowly. And thanks to a hobbyist out there where he put some of these bio cubes underneath the plenum because it was high enough to do so, so he placed a few underneath there. That helps also. So, but really, if you look years and years later at a slow-moving plenum, if you can look at the glass at the bottom, you're going to find out there's really not any dirt or anything down in there, okay? Because it's not pulling water so fast that it's dragging it down there and dragging all the fish waste and everything else down there. It is eventually going to migrate into your substrate by itself. It eventually is going to do that. It is then going to be broken down by bacteria and become mum. Mum is going to be inert, and it's not going to hurt anything. Okay, the slow-moving plenum, like I said, I've ran it for years and years. I know there are other people say, well, I've had sand at the bottom of my aquarium for years. Well, do you have proof? Do you have any pictures? Do you have anything you can prove? Because I do. I have pictures of old aquariums. In fact, before they even came out with digital cameras or anything, of photographs and everything of my aquarium using a slow-moving plenum. And they're all photographs and stuff. This is way before technology of digital even came around. And documented proof and everything about it. So this was just something I wanted to bring up to all of you, is that whether or not you believe in the oxyfiltration system and plenums, that's strictly up to you. But here's a case for you saltwater hobbyists who are listening to this. Here's a saltwater hobbyist who has a 40-year reef tank. And he's been using a slow-moving plenum all that time. And think about it. He said, you know, and the thing of it is, I took the undergravel filter out last year for a cleaning. I do that every 25 years, whether it needs it or not. Really? Every 25 years? Ooh, a lot of maintenance there, right? What do some people say? Oh, the noxic filtration, it's high maintenance. Oh, the noxic filtration, it doesn't work. Well, I don't know. Here's a guy who's running a reef tank for 40 years with it. I don't know. It's up to you. Anyhow, this is Dr. Novak. I want to thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel if you're new to this channel. I appreciate it. And till next time, happy fish keeping. And I'm going to come out with a lot more videos. I got a lot of them all lined up. I even have some manufacturer videos I have to make because I'm getting, letters from the manufacturer. Oh, you got to do this or something. So, but I do announce that. If it's from a manufacturer, I will tell you it's a video because the manufacturer has sent me a product. So, but I want to make sure when I do recommend products to you that they are good products, because I don't own a store, so I'm not worried about it. But anyhow, happy fish keeping, and thank you for watching.